The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television.
Hello and welcome to Compass, a production of Pioneer Public Television. I'm Les Heen, your host for Compass. This is a weekly discussion of public policy and important issues facing our viewing area. This week, what's happening with rural and nonprofit journalism? Well, as traditional business models show some weaknesses, people are asking, will nonprofit media organizations succeed? We'll have a discussion with folks who we think have some answers. First, we have the story of how One South Dakota magazine went from a nonprofit to a profit media model, and what kind of work they are doing across the state. Here's Pioneer's Laura K. Prosser with more on the story of Dakota Fire.
One story, one magazine at a time. Dakota Fire has sparked a rural revival since its launch in 2012. A tool to start a conversation about what's new, what's going on, and reimagining the possible in the Dakotas and surrounding areas. Here's their story.
I grew up on a farm north of Frederick, South Dakota. And when I was leaving there to go to college, I didn't think that I'd ever want to be back. But then when I went off to college, I found myself writing about the place where I had grown up, my family and the farm and our connections to the land. So then I had kind of a conflict because I was on the path to become a journalist, and I didn't think that I could do the kind of work that I wanted to do and live in the place where I wanted to live at the same time. Fast forward a few years to when I'm working at the Tribune in Ames, Iowa, and I had kind of assigned myself the rural beat, so I was really kind of learning a lot more about rural topics then. And I also started reading a lot more about rural topics, books by Michael Pollan and Wendell Berry, and I realized from all of that that there is important work to be done in rural places in terms of journalism. And I started to connect with the person who became my business partner in Dakota Fire, and we started talking about the kind of publication that we wanted to do together about rural issues and talking about how to make small communities thrive.
Grant funding allowed Dakota Fire to get off the ground and try new things. But the challenge of most grants is that they don't last forever, especially for a for-profit business working with a nonprofit organization to get that funding.
The saying that I've heard in journalism is that there's no silver bullet, that you need to look for silver buckshot, that you need to look for more than one source of revenue that can bring in what you need to keep you going. So you can go into the nonprofit direction and try to think about whether it's going to be grant funded, whether somebody from the outside is going to be paying for this, or you go into the for-profit direction and you end up either directly serving your readers through subscriptions, or you're serving advertisers through that model. It kind of depends on if you're looking very short term or if you're looking, into longer term. I mean, very short term, it depends on us getting enough advertising to be able to pay the print bill and salaries. Long term, we need to be looking at other creative ways of getting funding.
As of today, the magazine is still searching for the right funding format for their media model, a search that will continue as their magazine grows and develops, with each new extra hand they hire on, and as they spread out across the Dakotas.
I think technology makes it easier than it ever would have been, 15, 20 years ago. Wendy and I communicate by this messaging app called Slack many times a day. That's how we have most of our conversations. And that's not necessarily how we have our conversations with our writers. That's mostly still by email or by phone call. But I think technology makes it easier and a little more expected, you know, that you're going to be able to communicate over distance in a way that you couldn't before.
Because of technology, we're actually able to draw from a bigger pool of potential writers than we ever could have before, and also because of the geography that we cover. It benefits us to have people in all four corners of both of the Dakotas, and we're not quite spread that far out yet, but we do have people in, you know, very distant places from each other working together. And the benefit of that is those people have different levels of experience within journalism. You know, maybe they're better at a feature, or maybe they're better at hard-hitting news. From there, Heidi and I talk about specific ideas that we want to cover. We have usually one main story that we write that kind of is an overarching theme sort of concept, and then that's usually done by one of us, and then we have freelancers that we bring in for a lot of the other stories that go into it. We discuss what we want to pull out in that, you know, highlighting problems, but also highlighting potential solutions, telling what's happening throughout the region, and then also exploring what's possible to overcoming some of these things. We're very solution-based, and so we're not just going to say this is what's going on and let it go at that. We're really drilling down into, you know, the deeper problems, kind of looking under the surface of the water at the bottom of that iceberg, and then figuring out how can we break that down and find solutions for individual communities.
The new landscape of journalism requires news organizations to be willing to not only report on problems, but also to help people find solutions. The Dakota Fire Cafes are one of the ways that the magazine, the media company, interacts with the communities it covers and starts people talking about what they can do on issues that relate to them.
So it's intended to be kind of like the coffee shop in your town, where the men, or sometimes women, and sometimes together and sometimes not, get together and try to solve all the world's problems around that table. And so this is kind of a more structured way to say, all right, let's focus on what's going on in your community. What would you actually do to solve these problems? These are facilitated, carefully hosted conversations to make sure that we're really trying to get to the heart of the matter and staying focused on that topic. We may or may not actually solve that problem, but we're building relationships as we do and kind of getting a start to the direction that that community could go in a more positive way.
It's a really exciting process. It's incredible to see the things that people come up with to talk about that, you know, they don't even realize that their neighbor down the street has the same thoughts and concerns as they do. And all of a sudden they're sitting at the table. One time we had, I think it was an 89-year-old man and a 15-year-old young man sitting at the same table. And they had the same concerns in their community. And you know, that particular evening, it was the biggest event we ever had, and we just walked away feeling just so fulfilled that what we were doing was actually impacting a community. Because so many times in journalism, you kind of wonder if your ideas are going out there into the world, and you know, you try to skip a rock, and sometimes it just plunks down in the water, and you're hoping that it skids along and makes all these little ripples all over the place, but you don't know sometimes.
And with us now to discuss some regional models and trends in the world of nonprofit media, we have retired MinnPost writer David Brower, and also with us is South Dakota Newspaper Association President Dave Bordewick. So Dave and Dave, this is probably the first time I've had two Daves on this show, but
easy and confusing.
It is, and you know, and of course, it's. I mean, you know, we're media people, so we love talking about media. But there have been so many changes in the media business. And whether it's local newspapers or whether it's big newspapers, I know, David, you were in the Twin Cities for many years, saw that world up close and personal. You know, where are we going with nonprofit media? And Dave, I'll start with you first. Where do you think it's going?
Well, I mean, I worked in it with MinnPost, which is a nonprofit news site in the Twin Cities. It's an interesting story. They started in 2007 pretty much because we were all seeing the tremendous decline in jobs in the media. And at that time, the Star Tribune had just been purchased by a new company, a new group of private equity investors, and at a real discount price. And I think MinnPost, which was started by a former Strib guy, was thinking, let's try to fill some holes that we see that are inevitably going to come up as journalists lose jobs. Now, if you flash forward to 9 years later, the Star Tribune for the moment has stabilized. It's been stable for the last 6 or 7 years, really, or since its bankruptcy. And the headcount has stayed more or less the same. MinnPost has grown slowly, but it is growing. It has about 3,000 members, and for comparison, NPR has about 103,000. But the net result, I think, has been that there's actually more coverage of some things in the Twin Cities as a result of a traditional media outlet stabilizing and a new outlet being able to find some new revenues, which we can talk about later, and actually add some journalists to the mix, or at least keep the headcount from going down.
Sure. And David, in South Dakota, of course, you've got lots of small towns, lots of regional newspapers, lots of weeklies. You've got an interesting mix, but most of it, where it's a heavy emphasis on those communities. So what are the changes you're seeing in South Dakota?
Well, in South Dakota, I work for South Dakota Newspaper Association. We represent 128 newspapers, 117 of those who are weekly newspapers. And so, the running joke is, well, they're all nonprofit already, if you look at some of the weeks and some of the days' issues. But they are for-profit newspapers, albeit sometimes pretty slim margins for some of those papers. But we are seeing, I think, in South Dakota, sort of the initial discussions and the contemplations of some nonprofit models for journalism. Just because, as David has said, we've seen with some of our larger newspapers, some of our daily newspapers, cutbacks over the years that have affected their newsrooms. So you see these organizations looking to work together, to collaborate, and see how they can share content, share resources to do sort of those big picture stories that perhaps they were doing on their own in the past, but now they just don't have those resources individually to do it. And so they're looking for ways to tackle some of those big picture type journalism stories, but in a collaborative way, and also under the umbrella of perhaps a nonprofit type structure that we don't have right now, but I think you'll see coming in South Dakota.
And there are examples of this around the country where you've got organizations where they've sort of formed a consortia, let's say. I think there was an example of this in St. Louis. And one of the reasons I think was that, let's face it, some of these things that are really important, like investigative journalism, it's expensive, right? And so when things start to cut back, that's one of the first things that you see shrink.
Exactly. I mean, and that, as you know well from the Twin Cities, and that's the same in South Dakota as well. Those things have been trimmed back in recent times, but that journalism still is very important and needs to be done. And I think our newspapers don't want to see that go away, and so they're looking for ways to make that happen yet.
And there's some advantages. I know that when we started MinnPost, the Star Tribune was terrified that we were trying to take their business. Maybe terrified is too strong, but they were, let's just say, not super happy about it.
Sort of gnawing at the heels.
Not super happy about it. And from the inside of our shop, we were all going, they don't get it. Like, we're not here to take over their business. We're here to augment what readers get in terms of good civic coverage. Again, if you flash forward 9 years later, I think there's a much bigger recognition that that's really what's going on. MinnPost now has a feature in the Star Tribune every week on Greater Minnesota. And the reason is, when the Strib cut back, it focused. One of the things it's trying to focus on is investigations, but unfortunately, as people in your neck of the woods know, they cut back on Greater Minnesota coverage.
Right.
And so we have a grant from the Blandin Foundation, which allows us to cover Greater Minnesota as best we can. And so we are actually adding Greater Minnesota coverage back into the main daily in the Twin Cities because we're a nonprofit. And that's how it should work.
Right, and I think that's probably difficult for a lot of people to understand, because they can understand maybe that an investigative team of people clearly has expense because you have teams. But they don't necessarily understand that covering distant locations, and rural often fits that, is also where a lot of expense is. And that gets cut back.
And you see that as well, just in in our state capitol in South Dakota. I lobby on behalf of our association, and I've been doing that for 20 plus years. My first few years even in our state capitol, we had at least 6 or 7 reporters every day covering the State House, covering the Capitol. Well, that's not the case today, just because of the expense that goes, in large part, it goes with having a reporter in Pierre every day throughout the session to do so. But again, I go back to, even there, we're seeing media entities within the state looking to say, okay, how can we get back into the State House during the legislature by collaborating, putting our resources together to get coverage there, because they realize it's important. Citizens need that type of journalism.
Well, and there's actually some models, if you go way back and people look at the history of journalism, the Associated Press, as I recall, was essentially cooperative, correct?
Correct.
Still is.
Yep.
It still is.
Right. It is. Yeah. And, sometimes it's a contentious cooperative. They have to charge their members for their services, and there's some fights over that. It's not all win-win. In some ways, this strategy of cooperation it's like putting your finger in the dike, because you kind of like it when there's 6 or 7 or 10 reporters fighting for a story. Sure. On the other hand, from a manager's standpoint, that sometimes they're all fighting for the same sort of commodity coverage, the press release of the day, the news that anybody can do. And so again, I do see some signs that outlets are being smarter about trying to collaborate on things that are giant, because they're too big. And by the way, the costs of defending yourself against a libel case or just a frivolous suit to try to get you off the story, that's harder than ever for even big media organizations to bear. But if you can share the load, it makes it work. So you focus on more unique stories, and you, as you said, tend to create this little AP within your state capitals. I think the problem, I hope I'm not talking out of turn, but I think the problem is more acute in a state like South Dakota, where the big traditional papers have been owned by chains that have sort of cut back. In the Twin Cities, it's not really a problem for the Twin Cities. There's still a healthy amount of capital coverage there. But again, where I think it affects Minnesota the most is outside of the Twin Cities, because those papers, the Duluth paper has a good capital reporter, but not every paper that used to does. And that, I think, is where the biggest problems happen, and maybe is the biggest opportunity for, again, the nonprofit model. And the big thing about that is that it allows you to get foundation grants from other nonprofits. Foundations are generally nonprofit. That they generally don't give to newspapers because they're for-profit entities. So it does help you try to bring in some new revenues.
And the challenge is, as I think some of our folks are finding out, is the challenge is not so much finding those grants and getting that initial money as Dakota Fire has found, but it's just sustaining beyond that. Once that grant runs out, how do you keep that model going? That's the challenge, I think, for any nonprofit or any media organization that's looking to go down this path.
Sure, because typically in the nonprofit world, there's money to try something new, innovation, those kinds of things. But then, okay, now that you've had it for a few years, how do you sustain that model? And hopefully, as you said, with MinnPost, you build a base of members. Or like public television, obviously, we have members. That's what you hope you do, is build that base so you can continue it.
And one thing you do see that's new in my media experience is that even an outlet as large, relatively, as Minnesota Public Radio, when the economy tanked in the late 2000s, they, I think, relied more and more on grants to fill their holes. But grants, they're not advertising, but they come with strings. The funder wants you to cover a certain beat. Well, that takes some of the independence away from what you used to have to be able to put reporters where you thought they were needed. And then what happens is the grant funders, few, want to be involved for years and years and years. They usually want to, as you say, prime the pump, get you started, and then back away. Well, what's happened for a lot of us is a funder will back away and the ball just drops because it hasn't built the business, and there aren't enough people yet who are willing to pay for news through a membership. It's becoming a little more accepted, but it has a long way to go. People were used to having advertisers pay for their news. That's how your subscription price didn't do much, but now it's different.
In particular, people may not understand that if you have any given business, let's say, in a community that disappears, let's say implement dealers, car dealers. That a lot of the revenue came from specific kinds of businesses or specific business within the community. And if you have a fragile business model, the effects there can be pretty dramatic.
Exactly, and we've seen that, time and again, not just in South Dakota, but throughout the Midwest and the newspaper industry, community newspaper industry nationwide. I think, whereas years ago, one publisher could own 1 or 2 newspapers and make a pretty decent living on it. Well, now they need to own 4 or 5 or 6 of those community newspapers, chain them together in order to get the same sustainability that they had previously. Just because the auto dealers have consolidated, the hardware stores have consolidated, the grocery stores, their advertising has consolidated. And so Main Street has changed, the media, local media has changed
and
with
yet
it.
The communities have not consolidated. They're still independent, individual communities. And so there are these just tremendous discontinuities. And if you have a place that has a lot of people but doesn't have a lot of money, and you're relying on the people to pay for the media directly, they may want to. But they may have to put food on the table. They may have to get gas in the car. And so, again, it's just a very complicated system, and one that's really irregularly distributed, even more than it has been.
And then, of course, we haven't even talked yet about digital. But now you throw on top of that the perceived attitude, at least among some people, that we have a lot of people now who are thinking, well, I don't know if I should want to pay for any of it because I can just find what I need online, and that's a whole other layer of complexity.
But it's also an enabler as well. I mean, technology and the online world, in many respects, I think facilitates media to work together, to share that content, and to distribute that content digitally, where in the past those things weren't necessarily possible. So I think technology, in some respects, while it's brought in new competition and new dynamics, it also is in enabling the media to do things in a new way, to work together in new ways that weren't possible before as well, and that's a good thing too. So,
and the thing about digital, and I've worked in it now for a decade, is first of all, it's great if you're comfortable with the digital realm. Not everybody is, so you still have to have some other way to get out the news, and it's something that's hard for newspapers that are struggling to do their basic newspapering. Most of the money is still in print advertising, even after all these years in the internet era. And so you, as a publisher, you're in a tough spot. You feel compelled to keep publishing print, but the wave is digital, but you don't really have a ton of digital expertise. And so again, this is where partnerships can work with nonprofit outlets that really can't afford printing presses and probably wouldn't buy them if they could, to maybe become that hub or have that expertise that they can layer on top of the already local content that traditional media outlets are pretty good at.
Yeah, well, we've talked about the fact that there are all these business models, but let's say if you're someone who has always been reading a couple local newspapers, and you've appreciated the local radio news, and you've appreciated these local sources, and then you say, gee, it seems like there isn't as much there anymore. What's really at stake? Because it strikes me that a lot of people want really good quality. They want the investigative, they want the stories, but it's not out there. Is there a role that consumers start to play more in helping to determine the future of what news is in this nonprofit model?
Well, yes, I think there is, certainly. I mean, everything from citizen journalism, where citizens take it upon themselves to become de facto journalists and contribute content, either through self-publishing or publishing through other venues. I think that desire to be connected, to be informed, whether it be locally or on a larger scale geographically, is still so strong. Here in the Midwest, it's very strong, and so I think that will drive a lot of what will develop in terms of will we see nonprofits within the media succeed or take off. I mean, citizens and those who consume news and information, I think will ultimately drive the expectations of where that goes.
Well, it is ultimately up to the audience to decide how valuable this is. Again, I go back to this notion that people were not trained through I'm 56. I was never really trained to pay for news fully. And so they have to, it's the free market in a way, so that supply has to meet demand. And right now we're actually producing more supply than people are willing to pay for it. But that is slowly coming down. And so the question is whether this will come up, whether people will be willing. The Star Tribune in Minneapolis for a year costs $374 now. In 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was $100. That's the kind of thing where people are going to have to decide just how valuable this is. And journalists are going to have to decide, are we really creating value for people, or are we just doing it the way we always used to do it? And so I think we have to make sure we're serving the readers even better, and we have to think about how a new model will affect how we serve readers. But readers, I hate to say it, are also going to have to be the ones who pay the bills, because advertising doesn't work as well for mainstream media outlets as it used to. They can sell, a car dealership can go right to Auto Trader. I hate to say it, but that's what's changed.
So you're saying it's really frightening times.
Well, it's been frightening times for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And in a way, I'm a little bit stunned that we still have the media that we have.
Yeah.
After this. It's been punishing pressure. I mean, back in the day, a newspaper was effectively a monopoly on the advertising market, at least the print advertising market. And you could see the reason people made fortunes on newspapers was you're talking margins of 30, 40, 50%, which anybody who has a business knows that's insane. And now, I mean, I don't know what the margins are in South Dakota, but I can tell you that, like the Pioneer Press, that's a single-digit margin at best. It may not be even positive, but if it is, it's not positive by much. Now, that's more like the grocery business. People have made millions on the grocery business, but it's a different business, and that's what we're adjusting to.
So we've only got a couple of minutes left here, but I want to talk about where the media world goes next, either nonprofits or rural. Because, obviously, as you said, David, there's a lot of concern about what happens with rural coverage, because as large newspapers or radio stations, television stations, as they cut back, close the bureaus, bring the people in, don't send as many people out. So what's the future?
I still think, I'm optimistic. I think the future is still strong. I mean, yes, a lot of uncertainty for traditional media, for emerging media, and as well as nonprofit media. We don't know exactly where all the answers lie or where the successes will be. But what encourages me, based on my experience, is that I see people within the industry in South Dakota who are forging ahead, looking for those answers, looking for those paths that will lead them toward, sustainability in the future. And that, I think, ultimately is the answer, is just keep pressing, looking forward, and working hard to find where we need to go next. And
the good news is that there isn't an audience problem. There's a revenue problem. And at least there's not an audience problem. Newspapers have bigger audiences for their coverage through their digital footprints than they've ever had, ever. The difference is they don't have the classified ads like they used to, and they don't have certain other segments that can sell a different way. But it's an optimistic note to say that people still want news. That has not changed. If anything, that's increased. I think as our society ages, those tend to be your newspaper reader types. Kids have never read the newspaper really that much, except for the comics. It's when people get kids in the school system and all of that. And so if we can figure out a way, again, to just make ourselves relevant in people's lives and sort of train them that you get what you pay for, that's the hope.
Yeah, and that people grow into the audience. People grow into using news and take it from there. David, great to have you both here. We're out of time. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
That's it for this week on Compass. Join us next week for more people, places, and issues facing our region. Thanks.